There is a very specific kind of loneliness that only visits people who think too much. It is not the loneliness of having no one around. It is the loneliness of having convinced yourself that no one around you could possibly understand the weight of what is happening inside your head. And if we are honest, truly honest, most of us have tasted that loneliness at some point. We have all had that quiet, seductive whisper that says we see things others do not, that our suffering is more complex, that we are somehow operating on a different frequency than the rest of the world. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote an entire novel about what happens when that whisper wins. He called it Crime and Punishment, and it was published in 1866, but it might as well have been written this morning, because the disease it diagnoses has never been more prevalent than it is right now. Before we step into the mind of Raskolnikov, it is worth stepping into the mind of the man who created him. Because Dostoyevsky did not write this book from a place of comfortable observation. He wrote it from the wreckage of his own ego. By the time he sat down to compose Crime and Punishment, Dostoyevsky had already been arrested for political subversion, stood before a firing squad in a mock execution that he believed was real until the very last second, spent 4 years in a Siberian labor camp, and watched his first wife and his brother die in rapid succession. He was broke, he was epileptic, he was addicted to gambling. He had been humiliated by life in ways that most of us will never experience, and it was precisely that humiliation that cracked him open enough to see something essential about human nature. He understood, from the inside out, what it feels like to believe you are exceptional, and then to be crushed by reality until you realize that the belief itself was the thing destroying you. Crime and Punishment is not just a novel. It is a confession written in the third person. Dostoevsky poured his own intellectual pride, his own desperate rationalizations, his own spiritual crisis into Raskolnikov, and then he watched his character walk the exact path he himself had nearly walked. That is why the book feels less like fiction and more like someone grabbing you by the collar and telling you something they learned the hard way. Now, here is what most summaries get wrong about this novel. They frame it as a story about a man who commits a murder and then feels guilty. That is technically accurate, but it misses the entire point. The murder is almost beside the point. What Dostoevsky is really dissecting is the psychological architecture that makes someone believe they have the right to commit the murder in the first place, and more importantly, the way that architecture collapses under its own weight once it is tested by reality. The real crime in this book is not the axe. The real crime is the theory. The real punishment is not prison. The real punishment is the total isolation that comes from living inside a mind that has severed itself from every human being it could have loved. Raskolnikov is a former law student living in a coffin-sized room in St. Petersburg. He is brilliant. Everyone around him acknowledges this. He is also broke, starving, and consumed by a theory he has been developing in his isolation. The theory goes something like this. Humanity is divided into two categories. There are ordinary people who exist to follow the rules and reproduce, and there are extraordinary people, the Napoleons, the lawmakers, the world shapers, who have the moral right to transgress any boundary if it serves a higher purpose. Raskolnikov believes, or desperately needs to believe, that he belongs to the second category, and to prove it, he decides to murder an old pawnbroker he considers a parasite on society. If he can do it and feel nothing, if he can step over that moral line without flinching, then he will have confirmed his own greatness. That is the experiment. That is the bet he makes with his own soul. And here is where the book reaches across 160 years and grabs us by the throat, because we live in a culture that has quietly mass-produced Raskolnikov's theory without anyone noticing. We do not call it the theory of the extraordinary man anymore. We call it main character syndrome. We call it hustle culture. We call it the belief that we are the protagonist of a story in which everyone else is a background character. Social media has given us all a stage, and on that stage, we perform a version of ourselves that is smarter, more aware, more complex, more burdened by insight than the people scrolling past us. We have all, at some point, sat in a room full of people and felt a cold, exhilarating separation from them. a sense that we are watching the world from behind glass, analyzing it, dissecting it, and that this analytical distance is proof of our superiority rather than a symptom of our disconnection. That is Raskolnikov's disease. He does not commit murder because he is evil. He commits murder because he has thought himself out of his own humanity. He has spent so long inside his own head that other people have become abstractions, variables in an equation, and once people become abstractions, anything is permissible. Dostoyevsky captures this with terrifying precision. There is a moment early in the novel when Raskolnikov reflects on his plan with a strange detachment, and he says, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart." Read that line carefully. It is not a celebration of suffering. It is a trap disguised as wisdom. It is the lie that smart people tell themselves to make their isolation feel noble. We have all encountered some version of this. The idea that our pain is more refined than other people's pain, that our loneliness is not loneliness but the natural cost of seeing the world more clearly. Dostoyevsky puts this thought in Raskolnikov's mouth, not to validate it, but to expose it, to show us how easily intelligence becomes a prison when it is disconnected from empathy. The deep heart Raskolnikov claims to have is, at this point in the story, completely theoretical. He has retreated so far into abstraction that he can plan a murder and frame it as philosophy. That is not depth. That is the most dangerous kind of shallowness, the kind that looks like depth from the inside. And what happens after the murder is where Dostoevsky's genius truly reveals itself, because the punishment does not come from the outside. No one catches Raskolnikov. The detective, Porfiry, suspects him, circles him, toys with him, but never formally arrests him on evidence. The punishment is entirely internal. From the moment the axe falls, Raskolnikov begins to disintegrate. He develops a fever. He pushes away his mother, his sister, his only friend. He oscillates between grandiose defiance and absolute terror. He wanders the streets of St. Petersburg like a ghost, unable to connect with anyone, unable to confess, unable to stop confessing. His mind, the very instrument he worshipped, turns against him with a viciousness that is almost poetic. The theory said he would feel nothing. The theory said he would rise above. Instead, he is drowning. He is more trapped than he has ever been, not by external circumstances, but by the unbearable weight of a self that has nowhere left to go. This is the part that should make every modern overthinker pause. Because we have all experienced some version of this collapse, not through murder, obviously, but through the quieter violence of living entirely inside our own narratives. We have all had periods where we analyzed a relationship to death instead of simply being present in it. We have all constructed elaborate mental models of how the world works and then felt personally attacked when reality did not cooperate. We have all used our intelligence as a shield, convincing ourselves that understanding something is the same as experiencing it, that thinking about connection is the same as actually connecting. Raskolnikov is the extreme endpoint of this tendency, but the tendency itself is ordinary. It is everywhere. It is the background hum of modern life. And Dostoyevsky saw it coming a century and a half before we had a name for it. What finally begins to crack Raskolnikov open is not an argument. It is not a logical rebuttal to his theory. It is a person. Sonya Marmeladova, a young woman who has been forced into prostitution to feed her family, who has suffered in ways that dwarf Raskolnikov's intellectual anguish, and who has every reason to be bitter, cynical, and hard. But who is none of those things? Sonya does not debate Raskolnikov. She does not try to prove him wrong. She simply exists in front of him with a rawness and a compassion that his theory cannot account for. She is everything his framework cannot explain. A person who has been broken by life and who still chooses love, still chooses faith, still chooses other people. When Raskolnikov finally confesses to her, not to a judge, not to a priest, but to this suffering woman, it is not because she outwitted him. It is because she made him feel something his mind could not rationalize away. There is a moment when Raskolnikov, looking at Sonya, thinks with a kind of devastated wonder about her faith, and the text reveals that what breaks him is not guilt in the legal sense, but the sudden, shattering recognition that he has been wrong about the most fundamental thing. He has been wrong about what makes a person extraordinary. Sonya, by every metric of his theory, should be ordinary, disposable, a nobody. But she is the most genuinely powerful person in the novel because her power does not come from her mind. It comes from her willingness to remain open to other people, even when openness has cost her everything. This is Dostoevsky's answer, and it is an answer that our current moment desperately needs to hear. The cure for intellectual isolation is not more intellect. It is not a better theory, a sharper analysis, a more sophisticated framework. The cure is surrender. Not surrender in the sense of giving up, but surrender in the sense of letting go of the need to be the smartest person in the room, the most aware, the most complex. Letting go of the narrative that says our pain is special, our insight is unique, our perspective is the correct one. The most radical thing Raskolnikov does in the entire novel is not the murder. The most radical thing he does is fall to his knees in a public square and kiss the ground. It is an act of total ego dissolution. It is the moment when he stops being the extraordinary man and becomes, finally, just a man. And in that descent, paradoxically, he begins to rise. Now, it would be dishonest to pretend that Dostoevsky's solution is simple or that it translates neatly into a 5-step self-help program. It does not. Dostoevsky's answer is rooted in Russian Orthodox Christianity, in a very specific kind of spiritual surrender that not everyone will resonate with, and that is okay. But underneath the religious language, there is a psychological truth that is universal. The truth is this: we cannot think our way into belonging. We cannot analyze our way into love. We cannot theorize our way into meaning. At some point, the mind has to stop and the self has to risk something. It has to risk being ordinary. It has to risk being vulnerable. It has to risk being wrong. And that risk is terrifying because for people who have built their entire identity around being the one who understands, being wrong feels like annihilation. Raskolnikov would rather go to prison than admit his theory was flawed, because without the theory, who is he? Just another suffering person in a city full of suffering people. And that, Dostoyevsky tells us, is exactly what he needs to become. We live in an age that rewards the Raskolnikov in all of us. We are rewarded for being clever, for having takes, for constructing elaborate intellectual identities online and defending them against all comers. We are rewarded for analysis, for cynicism, for the kind of detached irony that keeps the world at arm's length. And none of this is inherently bad. Intelligence is a gift. Critical thinking is essential. But when intelligence becomes the only way we relate to the world, when thinking replaces feeling, when understanding replaces experiencing, when being right replaces being kind, we start to build our own coffin-sized rooms. We start to shrink. We start to disappear into ourselves. And the tragedy is that we often mistake this disappearance for transcendence. Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment as a warning, but also as an invitation. The warning is that the mind, left to its own devices, will eat itself. It will construct increasingly elaborate justifications for its own isolation, and it will call that isolation genius. The invitation is to come back. To come back down from the theory, from the analysis, from the exhausting performance of being exceptional, and to stand on the ground with everyone else, not because we are not smart, not because our insights are not valuable, but because the smartest thing we will ever do is admit that we are not separate, that our suffering is not more refined, that our loneliness is not more poetic, that we are, in the end, just people who need other people, and that this need is not a weakness to be transcended, but the very thing that makes us human. The last image of Raskolnikov in the novel is not a man who has figured everything out. It is a man who has finally stopped trying to figure everything out. He is in a Siberian prison camp. He has lost his freedom, his status, his theory, everything he once used to define himself, and for the first time in the entire book, he is at peace. Not because his circumstances have improved, they have gotten objectively worse, but because he has let go of the one thing that was actually killing him, which was the need to be above it all. Dostoyevsky tells us that a new story begins here, the story of a man's gradual renewal, and then he closes the book. He does not show us the renewal. He only shows us the moment when it becomes possible. And that moment is not a thought. It is not an insight. It is an exhale. It is the moment when someone finally stops performing their own intelligence and just sits with another person in the terrifying, beautiful simplicity of being alive. If that image haunts you, good, let it. Because it is not trying to make you feel guilty for being smart. It is trying to remind you that being smart was never the problem. The problem was believing that being smart was enough.